everyone, thank you for joining today's webinar. We will be doing a methodology breakdown on CDM's AMS-III.BB methodology, which focuses on electrification of communities through grid extension or the construction of mini grids. So let's get started. In our agenda today, we have 8 topics we will cover. These include some information about Envision blockchain, Guardian overview, recap of previous webinars, policy development checklists, an introduction of AMS about mini grids and centralized grids, how emission reductions are calculated, and our schemas and workflows. We will also end the webinar with a demo on open source Guardian, so stay tuned to see a tour of the platform, how we use tagging, selective disclosure, policy comparison, and a how-to for the AMS-III.BB policy. So before we begin going into the methodology specifics, let's do a quick overview of who we are. Envision Blockchain Solutions offers expertise in the Web3 space, specifically in building and maintaining applications that help organizations navigate their Web3 journey, with our specialized focus on guiding organizations through the 3 major milestones of use case analysis, proof of concept development, and scaled deployments. We're uniquely positioned to help our clients achieve their Web3 goals. And with our expertise as the builders and maintainers of the Guardian, we offer insights and support to ensure that our clients stay ahead of the curve in this fast-moving and dynamic space. So a little bit about Guardian. The Guardian provides auditable, traceable, and reproducible records that document the emission process and life cycle of carbon credits, which reduces fraud in the sustainability market. With the current problems in the environmental markets that include lack of auditability of sustainable finance, the use of analog systems, friction in project audit and verification, lack of price transparency, and sustainability reporting based on estimates, we could depend on the Guardian to offer solutions like making climate finance auditable. We could digitize and open source methodologies, scale validation and verification, and together we could make sustainability reporting credible. So to the right here, you could see our workflow engine, and this is how we build policies, digital methodologies within the Guardian. So you could use the policy workflow blocks like Legos to design your desired workflow, whether it's from a methodology from CDM, Vera, or maybe it's your own. And we'll go a little more in detail with that in our demo. At the heart of this ecosystem, we have 4 key technologies that enable us to deliver trusted and transparent solutions for the carbon market. First, we use W3C decentralized identifiers. DIDs are globally unique IDs that allow individuals and organizations to generate their own identifiers using systems they trust. By using DIDs, we can ensure that carbon credits are issued to the correct party and that they cannot be duplicated or manipulated in any way. Second, we use verifiable credentials. VCs are digital documents that provide information related to the subject, the issuing authority, the type of credential, specific attributes of the subject, and evidence related to how the credential was derived. By using VCs, we ensure that carbon credits are issued only to those who meet the necessary criteria and that the credits themselves are valid and trustworthy. Third, we use verifiable presentations. VPs are a collection of 1 or more VCs. We are also built on the Hedera public ledger, and we also have our policy workflow engine that we'll look at in our demo. We have 2 versions available of the Guardian. There's an open source version that's available to fork and use immediately. You can find all that information on our GitHub. Then we have the Managed Guardian service, which is a comprehensive solution that provides users with resources, tools, and support. With 2 options to get started, users can choose between a simple user interface for developing policies and running proof of concepts quickly, or fully customizable APIs for a more tailored experience. As a SaaS solution, the Managed Guardian service offers several benefits, including multi-tenancy and a reliable cloud infrastructure. This means that users can rely on the MGS-hosted infrastructure to work as expected, ensuring confidence in the application's policy execution environment. So just a recap of our past webinars. Starting in February, we have been hosting monthly webinars as part of our methodology breakdown series. Each webinar focuses on a specific methodology from our open source library and is aimed at helping our users and anyone interested in the Guardian to understand how these methodologies can be streamlined for efficient implementation. And we've covered methodologies like Vera's VM17, VM42. There is afforestation, reforestation, and revegetation methodology, where we also compared it to gold standards afforestation, reforestation methodology. Then we've been doing some of the CDM methodologies like AMS-III, AMS-III.B, AMS-II.G, and AMS-III.D. And all of these could be found on our YouTube if you want to learn more about those methodologies. We also have information about each one that is open sourced in our GitHub. So in this slide, we're going to discuss the essential steps you could take to create a policy for the Guardian. Creating a well-defined policy is crucial for effectively implementing the Guardian tool in your projects. So let's go through each step together. We have step 1, which is to identify the standard and an appropriate methodology. So you want to begin by identifying the relevant standard and methodology that aligns with your project's goals and requirements. This will serve as the foundation for developing your policy. Step 2 is to review the standard and methodology documents. So you'll want to make sure you read through the documentation provided by the standard and methodology, ensuring that there's a comprehensive understanding of their guidelines, criteria, and principles. Step 3 is to identify roles, processes, and requirements. So by identifying the various roles involved, you'll be able to define their responsibilities in the Guardian, then determine the necessary processes and requirements outlined by the standard, which will help you when you're working on your workflow. Step 4 is to identify input parameters and equations. Understand the specific input parameters and equations used in the methodology. These will be essential for accurately calculating and reporting the correct values. If you're using a policy in our open source library, then the equations will just need to be filled out using our forms in order for them to be auto-calculated. Creating a new policy is different because the equations all have to be mapped out using a program like Excel spreadsheets, for example, and then the information will have to be implemented using our policy configurator. Step 5 is to create a workflow and schema. This is when you would develop a clear workflow and schema that outlines the step-by-step processes for using the Guardian within your project. This will help streamline operations and ensure consistent application. This is also where knowing what roles play a part in your workflow is extremely important. Step 6 is to build a policy for the Guardian using the policy configurator. So now moving into specifics about AMS-III.BB. This methodology is for small-scale projects that focus on electrification of communities through grid extension or construction of new mini-grids. The typical projects are projects that supply electricity to consumers who, prior to the project implementation, were not connected to a national, regional grid, and were supplied by a high carbon-intensive mini-grid or standalone power generators. Also, fuel-based lighting systems might have been used before the project implementation. So the type of mitigation action as defined by CDM is the displacement of more GHG intensive outputs. This is when low carbon intensive grids or mini grid electricity displaces high carbon intensive electricity or lighting services. The tools referenced within this methodology, and you'll also see them in our completed policy, is tool 7, a tool to calculate the emission factor for an electricity system. We also have tool 21, the demonstration of additionality of small-scale project activities, and tool 33, which is default values for common parameters. We'll also take a look at that when we go into the Excel. So a little background information about mini grids and centralized grids. We'll go over the differences between each one of those as well as generators. So the scale of operation is one factor. Mini grids and generators are typically smaller in scale compared to centralized grids, leading to less efficient combustion processes and higher emissions per unit of electricity generated. Then we have fuel source. Mini grids and generators often rely on localized fuel sources such as diesel or fossil fuels, which tend to have higher carbon emissions compared to cleaner energy sources used in centralized grid. We have the lack of advanced emission control. Centralized grids often incorporate advanced emission control technologies and infrastructure, which help reduce pollutants. Mini grids and generators may lack such controls, causing more emissions. Maintenance and efficiency. Due to limited resources and technical capabilities, mini grids and generators may not undergo regular maintenance or achieve optimal fuel combustion efficiency, resulting in higher emissions, and grid integration. Centralized grids can leverage diverse energy sources, including cleaner renewables, which minimizes reliance on fossil fuels and reduces emissions. Mini grids and generators have limited capacity for integrating clean energy sources and therefore will cause more emissions. So if we look at this image here of what the baseline scenario looks like for these types of projects. So if we start at the top, you have fossil fuel that is used for lighting. Maybe it's a kerosene lamp. And then it's used by the consumer, but it's also causing CO2 emissions. Then at the bottom here, we have fossil fuel that's used for the power plant, which is causing CO2 emissions, and it's also used to generate electricity and then is used by the consumer. Now, if we compare that to the project scenario, we are using fossil fuels that are going to the grid, but are causing less CO2 emissions because the grid might be using a different type of fuel, or maybe they're using renewables. It could be a mix as well, causing less CO2. And that's used for electricity that is then used by the consumer. Now, if we look at the lighting can also be upgraded. Maybe you're not using a kerosene lamp and you're using LEDs instead, which are going to use less electricity and cause less emissions. So how are emission reductions calculated? And this is based on the AMS-III.BB calculation approach. So here we have one of the equations that are used in AMS-III.BB. This is the final equation that we also use to mint the correct amount of tokens. And we have our emission reductions as the part of the equation in black. And then we have our baseline emissions that need to be calculated following the equations in AMS-III.BB. We also have the project emissions that should also be calculated based on AMS-III.BB, and leakage. So when you subtract your project emissions and your leakage from your baseline, then you get your emission reductions that were achieved by the project activity. We'll also take a look at that in our schema, which is in Excel. So this is just an example of what our Excels look like. And now we're going to go into the actual Excel so we can go over each part. So at the top here, you see that we have different things like required field, schema type, parameter. The parameter one helps us organize each part that's coming from the methodology itself or the PDF. Then we have the question. And if we want to allow multiple answers, and then the answer, these are just here as an example, but this is what you would be filling out. So we start off with our project details. That could be information about the project itself, the project participant as well, what monitoring plan you're using, any reference methodologies. And then we start going down into the calculations. So if you see any part that is green, this is because these are being auto-calculated, where the white ones are what's going to be filled out by the user. Another thing to note is that we use Excel to design these methodologies instead of using the PDF, which is a traditional way of filling out the forms. So we create everything here to explain the logic of certain equations. We map out the flow to make it easier for someone who is developing this to understand what needs to be used, whether that's including tools, or maybe we have different types here or options. So starting here, we have an example of if you were to select the type of consumer that you have in this project. They could be a type 1, not metered, type 1 metered, type 2, or an existing consumer. So for this example, we have selected type 1, not metered, and we also selected option A. This means option A is down here. Option A is if you're using a master meter. Option B is for users that have sub-meters. And then we have option C if you're using data that's coming from a survey. So once we've selected all of our consumer types, we also have emissions from each consumer type that's coming from each one of these sheets. As you can see, we have or any auto-calculated fields. Then we move into our baseline emissions that is coming from each consumer. We're adding all of the emissions that they've reported. Then we have our project emissions, which is an equation that comes from the methodology. It uses Tool 7, as you can see, and the total electricity delivered from new or existing consumers. And then we have leakage, which has to be calculated by the user if they're using AM-45 or AM-104. And we have our emission reductions that we explained in that slide, which is the baseline emissions subtracted by the project emissions and by whatever is being reported as leakage. So once we go past all the different consumer types and any options that belong to that consumer type, we can go to Tool 7. Tool 7 is used to determine the operating margin, which will give you an emission factor. So here, these are all options that would be selected by the user to determine which operating margin they have to use to calculate their emission factor. So you have a simple operating margin, simple adjusted. You have the default lambda that's used for the simple adjusted, dispatch data, an average operating margin. Then we move into our build margin and our combined margin. And these are all used to look for the emission factor. So depending on what the methodology calls for, you would select the correct emission factor. Then we also have Tool 33, which is used for default values, and Tool 21, which is used for additionality. So once the full policy is developed, you'd see all of these things that need to be filled out in order to calculate each factor that we just went over. So now let's take a look at the policy workflow. So we have 3 users here, which are project participant, UNFCCC, and the BBB. Once the project participant and the BB have registered, UNFCCC will approve. Then the project participant will go ahead and start creating the project design document, which they will fill out things like the project details, baseline emissions, project emissions, leakage, any emission reductions. And they'll also fill out information needed for the tools 7, 21, and 33, like we just went over in the Excel. Then this would be submitted and it goes to UNFCCC, where they would add this project to the project pipeline. UNFCCC will then do a review of that information, where they can either approve or reject. If they reject it, you would have to go back and redo that project design document and resubmit it. So if they approved it, then we'd moved into the workflow step where they would add it to the project registry. And this is when the project activities begin monitoring. So there should be data that's collected and used to fill out the monitoring report. The monitoring report includes things like parameters that need to be updated as per AMS-III.BB guidelines, as well as any updates that need to be done to parameters from the tools. Once that's submitted, the BBB will then review, and they can also approve or reject this. If it's rejected, that monitoring report will have to be redone and resubmitted. The UNFCCC then gets access to the monitoring report, where they also review it, and the same thing applies. If it's rejected, it has to be redone and resubmitted. If it's approved, then the CERs will be issued. So now we're going to move into the Guardian to do a demo. So starting here, we have our user profile, and just to note, we are in an open source Guardian today, not the managed Guardian service. So we have information like the DID document, VC document, your balance of HBAR, your hedera account ID, DID, user topic, initialization topic. And then we move into these other tabs, like we have policies, tokens, and administration. So let's go to policies, where we could select schemas. Once you have uploaded your methodology or policy, you would have AMS-III.BB, which has been already uploaded. We could select that and see what schemas belong to it. So here we have things like the project participant. We have monitoring reports. You're going to see form or auto. Auto is everything that was green in the Excel, which is being auto calculated once you complete the form. Same thing applies to the project description. You have other schemas like BBB, emission reduction. So everything that was in the Excel is going to be here, except this is just a partial version of AMS-III.BB while we're fully developing the complete policy. So you'll see a lot more schemas. You'll see the ones for tool 7, 33, 21, all in here. Now, something to note is if we go to a schema like the project details and we select this edit button, We could take a look at what selective disclosure looks like in the Guardian. So if you clicked encrypted verifiable credentials, and I'm a user who doesn't want some of my information to be public. So for example, if I'm looking at my project location and I don't want that to be public, I can select private. Maybe I don't want my organization's name to be public. I could also select private. So everything that's been checked off is going to be encrypted and it's not going to be public, but everything that you leave unchecked will be publicly visible. And again, this is our feature called selective disclosure. Another cool thing about the Guardian is that you could compare policies. So if I select the compare button here, I can select my policy. I only have one imported, but you could import two and select your second one here. And this is to compare in this specific tab here that we're in the schemas one. So you can compare schemas. You could even compare the same policy in a different schema, and then you can click compare here and you're going to see how similar they are and what is different. If we wanted to compare schemas at a policy or compare them at a policy level instead of a schema level, we can go to the policy section and select compare. And now you're going to compare the full policy. So this is when you want to have multiple loaded already. So I would select this one. Let's say I had AMS-II.B. I would select that here. And then I can click compare and see the differences between each one. And the last thing we want to go over before doing our demo is tagging. Tagging can be done by selecting that button there. You can type something like AMS-III.BB if I'm a user and I have, let's say I have a research paper on this topic. I would put some information here saying it's a research paper, and I can attach the link in this same section and click create. Maybe your paper's about emission factors and how there's a better way to calculate that, and you can attach this to this policy. And anyone who's viewing it can now see the information that you've attached to it. So now let's go ahead and start the demo for AMS-III.BB. So I already have it in a dry run setting. I'm going to select go. Could also select the view config here and see the different workflow blocks for this specific one. And this is everything that's used to create this policy and all the steps that we're going to be taking as well. You could also select go through here. So I'm going to create two users by clicking on this button here. Now we have virtual user 1 and virtual user 2. I'm going to select virtual user 1 and assign a role. So I'm going to assign it to the project participant and select OK. Now we're going to give them a name. For this demo, I'm just going to put PP and select create. And now you see it says waiting for approval. So this is when UNFCCC would approve it, but we're going to go ahead and click on virtual user 2 to assign that role to the BBB. And we're going to give them the name BBB. And now it says waiting for approval as well. So we can go back to the administrator, which is UNFCCC. We have tabs like approve BBB, approve project participant, project pipeline, monitoring reports, token history, and trust chain. But now the UNFCCC can see information related to the BBB and select approve or reject. We're going to select approve. And then we could go to the project participant. They can do the same for the project participant and select approve or reject. So now going back to the project participant where they can start creating their new project by selecting here. So now we have our project detail schema that we could fill out. We're just going to use X's for these text values. So you have things like their address, their name, their telephone number, email. And again, if you don't want these public, this is when you can use the selected disclosure feature if you go to the schemas tab. Then we have our crediting period. We're just going to select a year from now, and our monitoring period. We're going to do the same. Then you would note what monitoring plan you're following. Here we could select the consumer types. So I'm going to select type 1, not metered. They have subcategories as well. So if you're using master meters, sub meters, or survey, you can add another consumer type. And we're going to just add type 1 metered. You'd put your project emissions and your leakage. And again, this form is going to be a lot longer once the policy is fully developed. You'd have information for your tools and more information to fill out for the type of consumer because of the tools. And let's select create. So now we see it says waiting for approval. We're going to go to the UNFCCC or the administrator, click on project pipeline, and this is when the UNFCCC would add this project to the project pipeline. They can select view document and see all the information that was filled out, and not just the form information that you type, but as well as any auto calculations that are occurring once you've selected OK. And then we're going to select approve. So we've added that to the project pipeline. Now we're going to go back to the project participant where they would add a report. And this is using monitored data. So we're just going to use what we already put in here and select create. Then we can go to the monitoring reports tab, where now you see an assign section here with a drop down. You're going to assign the BBB, and we can go to the BBB tab and click on monitoring reports. So they can also see the same information that the UNFCCC. However, this is now for the monitoring report, not just the project estimated values. And then they can select approve. The UNFCCC now has to approve this monitoring report as well, and they can select that. We see the status change to approved by UNFCCC, and we can click on token history, where we're going to see the amount of tokens that were minted, the date it was minted, what project it is. You could click view trust chain. And now here we have all the information that's tied to this minting event. So we have recipient name, what the token was, the token amount, the mint date, the verified signature, what policy this is, which is AMS-III.BB. You could also add a description here. We're in a dry run version. And then at the very bottom here, you see our trust chain, which we see every single step that was done, whether it was the policy being created, you know who did that. You also see automatic completion of project fields, where you can select this VC file. Each one has a button that you could select and open that and see all the information that belongs to that workflow step there. And as we keep going, every single step is going to reflect here with the party that did it, making everything easily audible and credible as well. And it goes all the way to this mint event, where we could also see a VC file for that. If you're watching this from home later on, maybe on YouTube, you could also find some information about us on GitHub, or you could submit policy requests, enhancements, or a bug. You can also message us on Discord on hedera.com/Discord, #sustainability, or you could reach us directly to Envision at our email, or maybe look for us on our website. All right, thank you all for joining, and we'll see you again next month.